You know, I read Kurt Vonnegut nearly nonstop. I just keep reading him. From the minute I started reading him, I just recycle. And he inspires me because he's funny inside of this morality that he has. And I love trying to have that same dry look at the world. But in young adult, Paul Zindel, because he wrote about weird kids and weird, you know, and it was the book for me that got me reading. I started reading The Pigman, and that was it. So those would be my two idols.
Well, my favorite book ever is Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt, and so she's sort of my idol. There's a rumor. My first job out of college was working for FSG, which is the publisher of that book, but there's a rumor that Tuck Everlasting needed absolutely no editing. So I don't know if that's true, it's my favorite book. So she's definitely an idol. But I think of recent times would be the author Gabrielle Zevin, who wrote the book Elsewhere, and it also sort of deals with life and death. So I think that's something I'm sort of drawn to as a reader. So everyone should read Elsewhere.
I always liked all the cartoons on TV. Bugs Bunny was one of my favorites. Chuck Jones, and I loved the Grinch and Charles Schultz. All the Christmas specials. I guess was inspired by it all.
In terms of what people do with language, Michael Ondaatje and his follower, I think, in many ways, Colin McCann. And in terms of a YA novel that, of course, started as an adult novel, The Book Thief, because I'm very interested in voice that is unexpected. To have Death tell that story is akin to when I had Squiggle River tell her own story of love. I think there's a lot of play done with voice and perspective, and I like that book led the way. But that was it. That's true.
Good question. For me, I think it's been kind of interesting for me. I think because I've been an artist my whole life and a writer for about a year and a half. So a lot of my inspiration does come from. I mean, it comes from all over. It comes from film. It comes from directors like Kurosawa. It comes from fine artists. It comes from. A lot of time people ask, like when I was doing comics, well, it just come from other comics, and yeah, I mean, there's some of that, but I'm actually more influenced by the outside and kind of trying to bring that to the medium, because I feel like otherwise you're just kind of regurgitating what's already there. And so on the writing side of things, although I think it's a really exciting time for young adult, middle grade. Sort of in Frankie's world, there's not a whole lot out there. I mean, there isn't much funny boy stuff, especially early reader boy. So I think I draw a lot more of my inspiration from other sources of comedy and even more adult writers. Like one of my favorite authors, Donald Westlake, who you wouldn't really put the two together, being this guy that wrote these caper novels and stuff. But his clever use of language, he's a very visual writer, and that for whatever reason I sort of take that and try to bring it to that younger audience, and just kind of think about whenever I talk to kids, I'm like, hey, it's cool to play. You can play your video games, you can play your watch cartoons, whatever, and that's just all awesome, and I enjoy it too. But the cool part about reading is that you get out there and you get to use your imagination. You get to fill in the blanks. You get to have this other connection. And I don't even know where I'm going with that. But my point is that I just try to pull it off from the outside.
Yeah, I think my influence is kind of like also very interested in old movies. I grew up in the 70s, and my dad grew up in the 40s, and he kind of raised me like it was 1947. So I'd read Flash Gordon reprint comics and Prince Valiant. And we watched, we had a Super 8 projector and pulled out, and we watched Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and the original King Kong. And then when I got older, not too much older, I was watching Orson Welles and John Ford and Hitchcock and all that stuff. So that's always kind of the stuff I was sort of interested in. And I'm interested in influenced by books too. But I'm just, as a general thing, I think everyone has this where you have influences and you kind of stick them in your head and kind of melt them around. And then when you're doing your own thing, you're not necessarily saying, I want to do just that. You're kind of trying to bring your own thing to it. So I think the people that I look at that influence me are not necessarily book things, or some of the books, but, people who brought something new. It's like Buster Keaton in the silent film. He just created stuff that nobody else was doing as a director and as a comedian. I'm actually, my second book after this next novel was about Buster Keaton as a kid. And Orson Welles, he was 25 and made Citizen Kane, and there was no movie like Citizen Kane. He did. And he said because he didn't know what he was doing. He was coming from this theater where he was doing these crazy things, and he didn't know he couldn't do something. So he did it, and I think that's really exciting. Like Jim Henson, who created the Muppets, and Charles Schultz, and the Beatles, and things like that kind of inspire me. And for books, The Creepiness of Ray Bradbury was an influence. There's too many illustrators to kind of even get into. N.C. Wyeth is a big influence. You don't really see it in my work, but it's in my head. So I think that's how a lot of the influences kind of come out. You don't want to kind of say this is my version of this because you're never going to, I'd love to do something funny, but I'm not sure if I can. One of my favorite authors is P.G. Wodehouse, which I think is the funniest books I've ever read in my life. And I keep thinking, I want to do a book like this, and then I don't think I'm that funny. There's only one thing missing. It was brilliantly funny. I don't think I am. But I think that's how you use influences.
Then it's funny to me that Eric said Donald Westlake for the Frankie Pickle books because my Ella and Jazz Mysteries are kind of the same age group, and my inspiration for those are really Janet Evanovich because I love her books, and she's very slapstick, and her main character who is the bounty hunter, sort of a detective. She's the one who always ends up covered in, her car blows up in every single book at least 5 times, and, she always ends up covered in torn feathers or some equivalent, and so in my books, Milo always ends up that way. Things always happen to him like that. And I think anytime I manage to be funny in those books, I'm sort of channeling Janet, But with picture books, I think my real hero is Miss Rumphius. I don't know if anyone's read that book, but I cannot get through to the end of that book without crying. I mean, every time, on the last page, I just start to tear up, It's a book where, for anyone who hasn't read it, beautiful picture book in which this little girl grows up and has 3 goals. One is to travel and see faraway places, and one is to come home and live by the sea, and the third is to make the world a more beautiful place. And there's this great moment in the book where she's done the first 2 things, and she goes out and she says this thing that to me is sort of unbelievable in a way. She says, the world was already pretty nice. What could she do to make it even better? And I spend so much of my life worrying about how the world isn't nice enough and how can we make it better that I just love that thought.